Hello everybody. So in this video I'm gonna try to keep talking about this paradigm shift that we're witnessing with Bitcoin and Bitcoin derivatives related to really the S&P 500 and even the delta between the QQQ and the S&P right now is very stunning, meaning the QQQ is down less than the S&P. We're seeing a change in what is going on in the market and what is considered risky and not risky, and hence the question of this video: is Bitcoin now risk off? Are we entering a period where Bitcoin is risk off, and maybe to a lesser extent where tech stocks could actually be risk off? You know, there's no tariff issues with tech stocks, right? It's a service. Anyways, let's talk about a few things that are going on. A few things that are going on is, of course, and in US hours, it doesn't seem as bad as what the rest of the world saw, right? We're like, what, 8 hours or 7 hours ahead of the UK, depending on when we're located. So in US hours, this doesn't look that bad. But if you are living in Europe, this looks awful, and in fact, let me just read some of the Watcher Guru tweets here to see what happened in the past really 24 hours. Singapore stock market suffers the worst single day crash in 16 years. China stock market worst single day crash since 2008. Taiwan stock market was halted, of course. Thailand banned short selling. This is something that South Korea does too sometimes. That's whenever there's a crash, they don't want it to be doubled down by short sellers. So that's another sign that things are pretty dire. BlackRock, that was US time here, not too long ago, like 2 hours ago. CEO BlackRock say, oh, it could drop another 20%. Of course, the CEO of BlackRock is heavily followed. Again, a few hours ago, S&P 500 officially enters bear market territory. And how many days did that take? 3 days? 4 days? I think it took 4 days. Like, it took us 4 days to enter that. This is just ridiculous. And of course, 2 hours ago this morning, 2.1 trillion wiped out from US markets. So we are doing significantly better on Friday, where we wiped out more than 3 trillion. 2.1 this morning. Of course, if you're watching this right now, the afternoon in the United States, it's looking better. But when I was making this video 2 hours ago, it was looking pretty bad. Anyways, an hour ago, so that'd be like 3 hours ago, now that I'm recording this, Bitcoin casually reclaimed 80K. So casually. Bitcoin reclaims 80K. It just did that. It just reclaimed 80K. If you look at the chart of Bitcoin, this is looking like your pretty typical Sunday night market manipulation. You know, Binance, Coinbase, their buddies, they sell thousands of Bitcoins at a very low price. They put in an order, the Bitcoin crash, and then they can just swoop in and just buy back the Bitcoin and make, I don't know, 0.5%, 1%, whatever, every week. They do this every week. This looks like the pretty standard Sunday drop to me, and then it's going back up, and a pretty standard Monday, Tuesday. It takes a few days, maybe a few hours to reclaim the level that it was trading on early Sunday. It's literally acting like a typical week for Bitcoin. And, I can't emphasize this enough. I said this in my last video. At this crisis, this event, which in my video from yesterday, I've compared to 1987 because of the extent of the 3-day crash streak, 3 days in a row. 1987, we had essentially that same drop in a single day, but that can't happen because of circuit breakers. Anyways, the point is, imagine if we had had this, because the reference is either 2008 or 87. Imagine we had had this, and it's 2022. What would Bitcoin be? Bitcoin would have dropped from 80 to 30, maybe even lower. I don't know, but in my view, it makes this makes no doubt that it would have done that. The fact that it's reclaiming 80K as I speak is just stunning. And frankly, you know what? I would still find it stunning if Bitcoin was at 72 or something. I would still find it stunning. Bitcoin should have dropped so much more if conventional wisdom of traditional finance is to be believed, if the stuff of people who don't think for themselves that they've been telling us for 10 years, those people who don't think for themselves, that, Bitcoin is crap. And now you see this and you realize, oh, wait a minute. this is the paradigm shift that I think a lot of people in Bitcoin are celebrating, including myself. So let's talk about the proxies, because I'm mostly a stock channel, right? And so on this channel, we discuss the proxies. You may remember I've discussed MicroStrategy for so long on the channel. Okay, anyways, MicroStrategy, a stock with one leg in TradFi, and that's a mess right now, and one leg in digital finance, namely Bitcoin, and that's a rock. That's the rock. Bitcoin is the rock right now. TradFi is the mess. And so you end up with kind of this hybrid asset. This Bitcoin proxy is a hybrid asset with one leg in one bucket and another leg in another bucket. And so you end up arguably with a hybrid performance, although the performance of MicroStrategy has been absolutely outstanding this week. People have been buying the dip, because if you look in 1 week, right, MicroStrategy is down 4.7%. Bitcoin over the same week, right, is down 6.3%, and the Nasdaq is down 10%. So I mean, it's roughly the same, right? Because some weeks MicroStrategy drops a little more than Bitcoin. So MicroStrategy performed way better than Bitcoin this week. But the point is, it seems either asset you look at, it's not dropping nearly as much as the Nasdaq. The hedge funds, they're just battering all stocks, and they're having a much harder time doing that to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a resilient asset. And if you put into perspective that today, of course, MicroStrategy is down 9% or 9.8%, it was up 5% Friday. So that's not a big deal, point number one. But point number two, when you consider that it's down almost 10% on a day where this news comes out from Bloomberg, right? This is the news from Bloomberg. MicroStrategy will register a $5.9 billion loss. So this is when you usually get, CNBC X screaming Ponzi, Ponzi, Ponzi. Bitcoin did not close where it needed to close for this stock to be included in the S&P 500 for MicroStrategy to do that. And so you have this headline all over when you look at for MicroStrategy, and the stock is only down 9%. In my view, this is pretty stunning. And if you look at the performance of MicroStrategy, like I said, over 1 week, it's minus 4.7%. So MicroStrategy was 277 7 days ago, 277. Right now it's 264. Barely noticeable change, a barely noticeable change. The other paradigm shift that I want to briefly talk about here is, and this is another winning point, another win for the thinking for yourself strategy, is, are we entering a world where QQQ is safer than the S&P 500? And I've always said that. When I look at the S&P 500, I see giant zombies with so much debt. I can think of General Motors. I can think of, the Comcast. I can think of so many companies who have these giant things waiting to collapse. That's what I see when I see the S&P. I see very little of that when I see the triple Q, very little of that. And if you look at that, the theory, the finance folks, the educated folks in the field, the MBAs, in theory, they will tell you, well, you have less volatility in the S&P 500. It is quote unquote safer. Well, is it? Is it really safer? This is the second day in a row where the S&P 500 is dropping more than the Nasdaq, and that's about what? That's about close to a 50%. Maybe not quite, but it's significant, right? What it's the QQQ is not dropping as much as the S&P 500 for the second day in a row. So imagine the S&P is turning into a higher volatility, lower return asset. Like, historically, people have owned the S&P because, they can sleep better at night, right? Because they have less swings up and down. That's the whole point of S&P. And so over the long run, you settle for an 11% return instead of a 16% return. Why do you settle for that? Because you want to sleep better at night. Well, how is sleeping better at night right now with the S&P actually dropping much, much more than the Nasdaq? And that's the second day in a row. And, in my view, this is what happens when you have geriatric committees in charge. And, for the S&P, that's another special case of that. I'm very critical of the Fed and the decisions they make. The S&P committee, the strength of the QQQ is that there's no committees. There's no humans in the loop. It's a simple formula, right? The S&P 500, there's a committee voting. And if you follow Tesla, like I have for a very long while, I've been into Tesla for a long time. If you follow Tesla, you remember that Tesla was denied entry into the S&P 500 for the longest time because that committee on the S&P 500 was like, well, Tesla doesn't have enough models, so we shouldn't have Tesla to the S&P 500. And they missed out on huge gains. They missed out on enormous gains for holders of the S&P 500 because the committee didn't want to put Tesla because Tesla didn't have enough auto models. And that was entirely arbitrary. And I know a lot of people in the MicroStrategy world were hopeful that MicroStrategy would become eligible for the S&P 500. They did not because of this, right? Because of Bitcoin being too low, there's this accounting loss, so they're not eligible. But even if they were eligible, do you think the committee would have something to say about MSTR entering the S&P? Probably the committee would be like, well, actually, we probably don't want MSTR to enter the S&P. That's the beauty of the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq is just a simple formula based on market cap. The S&P is not, and be very careful of that distinction. You're not buying a total world stock market when you buy a S&P. You're buying something that's based off of a committee, and that's very, very important. People's biases play into play, and the biases in finance are enormous, absolutely enormous, especially against innovation and against new companies. Look at Cathie Wood. Look at what's happening to her phones whenever she speaks, and how she's being the laughing stock of Wall Street. Anyways, I love Cathie Wood, by the way. I don't agree with all of her picks, but I think she's great. Anyways, the point is, MicroStrategy's operations this week. What happened this week? Nothing. They bought nothing. Why? And so, well, there's multiple answers to that. First of all, this is not the first week they buy nothing. There's been a few weeks where they bought nothing because they wanted to be silent with the earnings. And there's a rule about that, of course. There's another week where they essentially bought nothing because they had bought 10 million. So it was just for show. I mean, they didn't really buy anything. So the lesser reason I would tell you is because they want to stay unpredictable. Or that's my lesser explanation. My bigger explanation as to why they didn't buy this week is they had a huge buy the week prior. But also, like, let's say Saylor's waiting, he's looking at Monday. Okay, Monday is no good. Tuesday is no good. He's waiting Monday, Tuesday, and he doesn't tap the ATM on anything because it doesn't look very good. And then Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday looks even worse. So he's even less likely to tap the ATM on those days. So very, very few people were buying stocks Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of last week, right? The volume has been out. And so of course he didn't sell preferred. Of course he didn't sell stock during such moments of market turmoil. So I think that's the bigger reason as to why there was no buy this week. When TradFi is sick, MSTR is still great in my view because they own a bunch of Bitcoin on the balance sheet and they should be valued based on the Bitcoin that they have. They're great, but they still can't generate a Bitcoin yield because there's no such thing as TradFi running to buy a bond or to buy a preferred or to buy a stock. There's no such thing. So they can't raise and earn yield when TradFi is sick. But that sickness, we'll see how long TradFi is going to be sick. My guess is it's not going to be very long. These periods usually don't last very, very, very long. But anyways, let me conclude with some price to NAV updates. MSTR, MicroStrategy is not as cheap as it once was. 6 weeks ago, it was still cheaper. It's cheap, it's 263. It retraced nicely down, but it's not as cheap as it once was. Still, I remember it was under 1.5. I 1.4. That was a great buying opportunity. It went down to just under the 220s at one point. That was 6 weeks, 8 weeks ago. I can't remember. Anyways, I was buying back then. We'll see what happens now with that price. It's definitely tempting. Mara bounced back because it was trading. People were advertising on X saying Mara was trading under price to NAV. Like the best I calculated with my spreadsheets is that it was trading exactly at 1x price to NAV. So you're getting exactly the mining business, the energy generation, the wind farms, the land. You were getting that for free. But that was in pre-market overnight on Robinhood. So it really depends which platform you're using. I did not see it. I'm sure on some platform, Mara was at a 0.98. I just didn't see it on my end. So anyway, Semler price to NAV is still so low. So we'll get to that in a second. I'll make a special mention of Sailor in a sec. And CleanSpark, this is my big question of CleanSpark. What is CleanSpark waiting to monetize that price to NAV? Thinking like a sailor, or, I mean, trying, not that I ever would be able to do that, but just even trying to put my sailor cap on, I'm like, okay, you have a 2.4x price to NAV. Now it's time to monetize it. And if I were CleanSpark, I'd love to see them issue some common and use that common to simply buy Bitcoin. But anyways, they have the highest price to NAV. Good for CleanSpark. At some point, I think they should monetize it and do something with that. Let me finish with Semler, and I want to talk briefly about GameStop. So Semler, you may remember Semler was actually trading in the 2s price to NAV. That was 3-4 months ago. Okay, Semler dropped a lot. A lot of a drop of Semler is not related to Bitcoin. A lot of a drop of Semler is related to Medicare, and Medicare having QuantaFlow, which is their main device, their PAD detection device, being under review, and there's a pending investigation. I don't own it, so I didn't fully go into it and study it pretty closely. But there is an issue with the main business, and I know from listening, of course, to Semler is that them being taken off the local coverage determination with Medicare is what prompted them to buy Bitcoin, because of course Medicare decided that they would die if they are not included in the LCD. This happens so often in medical companies. I think Bitcoin is going to be very, very popular with medical device companies, with drug companies who find the FDA or Medicare arbitrarily removing something that had made them successful in the past. Well, what are your options in this case? Developing a new product takes years. The defensive option is to buy Bitcoin. That's what Semler did. And then you have GameStop. Now, GameStop didn't really need to buy Bitcoin. I would argue for GameStop, buying Bitcoin was more of an offensive strategy. They went on the offense. But, even though they raised 1.5 billion saying that they wanted to buy Bitcoin, they've only bought 10 million so far. So it's going to take a while for GameStop's big Bitcoin bag to matter in the valuation of Bitcoin. So it's not anytime soon that I'll add Bitcoin there, because it would look ridiculous on a price to NAV basis. It would not be meaningful. Bitcoin for now is just dipping the toes in Bitcoin, not barely anything. I'm hoping that those 1.5 billion in convertible notes will be used to buy Bitcoin and to not say do another business endeavor or grow something else. That's what I'm hoping, but we'll see. Anyways, risk off? Is Bitcoin not now risk off? Well, I have no idea. Things could get even crazier, and that's never out of a question. But it sure is looking better than it ever did for Bitcoin. I'll conclude with that. Bitcoin and Bitcoin proxies are looking better than they ever did, and that alone is a point to rejoice about if you've been following the space for a long time, like I have. So, anyways, this was not investment advice, not financial advice, just entertainment. I hope you were entertained. Please like, please subscribe, follow me on Patreon, follow me on X. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.